Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 4th, 2021, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Arrington, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Minority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are going to spend the next hour to raise to the attention of every American the large and looming crisis that hangs over the heads of our fellow Americans, but especially the next generation of Americans, on account of our ever-growing, massive, almost incalculable national debt at $31 trillion and counting, with a projection of $16 trillion over the next decade, by the way, half of which will be interest payments on the debt without a single dollar or dime going to something productive to help a soldier or a sailor or a senior with a safety net program. It will be servicing the debt of this country. And I believe this is the long-term greatest threat to America. I believe, as Admiral Mullen stated when asked by the defense community what the greatest national threat, security threat was, he replied, the national debt is the greatest national security threat. Why? Because a debt crisis in any form will undermine our ability to provide for the common defense and have a military and weapon systems that will be sufficient for the ever-evolving and growing threats, especially the great power threats like China. It will undermine economic security and prosperity and this land of opportunity, this American promise for our children and grandchildren. So this, I don't believe there's a more important issue. And the founding father, the father of America, our first president, George Washington, in his farewell address, warned us about three big threats. He mentioned foreign influence, factions that divide us and weaken the bonds of American unity and American oneness. But then he mentioned that we must avoid the accumulation of debt, not only by shunning occasions of expense, but by vigorous exertion in times of peace to discharge the debts which unavoidable wars may have occasioned. Translation, you may have to borrow money when you're in a world war, but just like the last time we were over 100% debt to GDP, our nation was willing to make the cuts to expenses and bring down the debt when we were in peacetime. We are now at 128% over the size of debt relative to our economy in World War II. We are carrying the largest debt in the history of the United States, and we're not at war. And the horizon and the trajectory, not only 10 years, but if you look at 100 or 30 years, it's over $120 trillion in additional debt. It's mind-boggling. It's unconscionable, and I think it's immoral to hand a country in such shambles fiscally and so bankrupt to the next generation and just literally wipe out their future and the blessings of liberty and opportunity that every generation of Americans have inherited to date. He says that. He says we should avoid these things. We should bend the expense curve. We should bring down debt and not ungenerously throw that debt upon posterity. The burden, he says, which we ourselves ought to bear. I see that every day in Congress. Instead of us bearing the burden by paying for the government that we believe the American people want, I'm not so sure they want this government, this ever-expanding government, but when we are giving that government to them, we ought to pay for it. and not defer the taxes on the next generation. And that is not an American, that's not the American way. That's not been the American tradition of our lawmakers. And we are in a real bad spot. And it's going to take courage. It's going to take courage from everybody, regardless of party, to find a way not only to start paying for things through expense cuts, and in the case of my Democrat colleagues, raising revenue, we're way beyond just being able to offset and even grow the economy and get out of this debt hole. We're going to have to take extraordinary action, and it's going to require extraordinary courage. Quite frankly, I haven't seen that on either side. But we have a tremendous opportunity, I think, in the future as Republicans look to take over in the House as the majority party, and they get to demonstrate to the American people leadership on this issue. We've seen $5 trillion in new spending over the last 2 years under this administration. $5 trillion. And I hope and pray that my party and will live up to the confidence and trust that the American people will put into us to steward this great nation of ours and lead and take on the great challenge of the 21st century, which is this national debt. I've got more to say, but my dear friends and colleagues are here from all over the country to speak on this matter. And the first one is my dear friend from Kansas, the 1st District of Kansas. A man who's no stranger to public service, served his great state as lieutenant governor, now serving in the United States Congress. He asked me to remind folks that he represents the great state of Kansas and his alma mater, Kansas State, which upset the Oklahoma University Sooners. Now they've beat them 3 out of the last 4 times. So that's pretty darn impressive. So with that track record, please lend him your ears, my fellow Americans. Tracy Mann.
Well, I thank the gentleman for yielding me time. From West Texas, my good friend, Red Raider. I would say if K-State can beat OU 3 out of the last 4 years, certainly we can make massive progress on this